He used to conduct orchestras. Now he mops floors. Thomas Reed was once a respected music teacher, until a single accusation stripped him of his career, his dignity, and nearly his will to keep going. Years later, he's a janitor in the same building he once filled with symphonies, haunted by silence, surviving for his daughter. But when a cruel joke drags his past into the spotlight, Thomas is forced to decide hide in the shadows or let the music speak again. "Careful with that cloth," Thomas whispered. "This one remembers things." He wasn't talking to anyone, just the Steinway in front of him, the one he'd polished every Thursday afternoon for 3 years, without missing a beat. His fingers moved gently across the wood, like he was tracing a story only he could still read. He'd come early before the gala staff arrived to clean the stage instruments. Not because it was part of his job. It wasn't. It was because the silence of this room didn't judge him. The Lexington Conservatory's main hall was a Baroque masterpiece of light and wood, with chandeliers like constellations and a stage that had seen legends. Thomas once stood there, chalk in one hand, baton in the other, before his life fractured like a cracked vinyl. From behind a red velvet curtain, a small voice broke the stillness. "You're talking to a piano again." Thomas turned, and there was Ruby, 8 years old, freckles and big opinions, hugging her sketchpad like it held national secrets. She wasn't supposed to be there, but he let her come sometimes, only on days when the silence in her eyes mirrored his. "It's not just a piano," he said. "It's a witness." Ruby blinked. "Witness to what?" "Everything people tried to forget." She didn't answer, just sat cross-legged on the steps and started to draw. Thomas returned to his work, not with urgency, but reverence. He knew every groove on that instrument better than the lines on his own palm. The curve of the lid, the tension in the pedal, the slight discoloration under middle C, where sweat and memory still lingered. He didn't see the door open, didn't hear the clicks of leather soles, but the voice was unmistakable. My God, the janitor's in love with the furniture. Maxwell Dorr, music critic, donor liaison, professional snob. He descended the stairs like a disapproving king, drink in handscarf carelessly flung over one shoulder. Thomas didn't flinch. He'd been called worse. Maxwell chuckled, eyeing the stage like it was beneath him. "Does it sing to you? Read whisper secrets about your glory days?" A few nearby staffers, tech interns, mostly let out awkward laughs. Thomas didn't respond. He just folded his cloth slowly, tucking it into the metal bucket beside him. Maxwell circled him like a cat with a cornered bird. "It's adorable, really, the way some men cling to the past like it's still breathing. I mean, it's just a piano. Or did they not teach you that at your community college?" Ruby stopped sketching. Her pencil stilled. She looked up at her father, unsure. Thomas finally looked Maxwell in the eye. Calm, direct, not a flicker of shame. "It's a Steinway Model D, 9 feet of Sitka spruce and hard rock maple, over 12,000 moving parts. And it's more alive than most critics I've met." Silence. One of the interns coughed. Maxwell's jaw tensed. But Thomas didn't linger. He bent to collect his supplies, motioned subtly for Ruby to follow, and walked off stage with the dignity of a man refusing to wrestle pigs in public. Backstage, Ruby pulled at his sleeve. "Why don't you ever say anything back, like, really back?" "Because I don't need to win arguments," Thomas said. "I just need to still be standing." He meant it, but the truth. His silence wasn't strength. It was exhaustion. And Maxwell's words. They hadn't cut deep because of the insult. They cut deep because for a second, Thomas had wondered if they were true. Later that night, as donors trickled into the foyer in sequins and silk, Thomas stayed in the wings, watching, cleaning, vanishing. Ruby sat quietly beside him, flipping through her sketchpad. But then her eyes darted to the stage, to the Steinway. "Was that the one you used to play, Dad?" He hesitated. "No," he said. But she didn't believe him. She turned a page, began to draw something new, Something more detailed. A man in a janitor's vest, one hand on a piano, the other gripping something invisible. And in that moment, without saying a word, Ruby made a quiet decision. If the world was going to keep her father invisible, she would find a way to make them see. And neither of them knew that before the night was over, the piano would speak louder than any of them expected. Ruby didn't sleep much that night. Not because of the fancy hall or the rude man with shiny shoes, but because of the way her dad looked when he walked off that stage. Not embarrassed, not angry, just smaller. Like someone folding themselves into a shape the world found easier to ignore. The sketch she'd finished at midnight still sat beside her bed, her dad next to the Steinway, his shoulders hunched, face half hidden in shadow. But she hadn't drawn him holding a mop. She'd drawn him holding a baton. By the next afternoon, Ruby was sitting in the school library with a tablet she'd borrowed from her class's media cart. She wasn't supposed to be there after hours, but the librarian liked her something about her being quiet and intense. She searched Thomas Reed music teacher, Lexington Conservatory. The results were confusing. News blurbs from 4 years ago. An internal memo. One headline read, "Beloved music instructor resigns amid conduct investigation." Another, "No charges filed conservatory releases statement." But there were no details. Just a fog of suggestion, like the kind grown-ups leave behind when they want something to be forgotten, but not understood. Ruby tapped open an archived article with a single photo, her dad younger standing beside a piano, his expression somewhere between proud and uncertain. She stared at it, trying to align it with the man who now folded laundry for a living and cleaned up spilled hors d'oeuvres off marble floors. At home that evening, Thomas stirred pasta on the stove, with one hand leafing through unopened mail with the other. Ruby sat on the counter legs, swinging arms crossed. "Did you really teach here?" she asked softly. He froze, just for a second. "Yeah," he said, turning off the burner. "Why'd you stop?" He didn't look at her. "Sometimes things happen that change the way people see you. And sometimes you let them. But you didn't do anything wrong." Thomas dried his hands, turned to face her. "I did what I thought was right. And that made the wrong people nervous." Ruby didn't press. Not yet. But she watched his face closely, and for the first time saw guilt where she used to see distance. Later that week, during lunch, Ruby followed the assistant dean to the basement archive room, pretending she was delivering a note. She'd memorized the floor plan from a field trip last semester. The conservatory had a digital storage system, but some old files, especially personnel ones, still lived in boxes. She found a folder labeled T. Reed, 2018, and carefully cracked it open. Inside were reports letters and one torn memo with 3 words underlined: student protection protocols. Another non-compliance with donor agreements. She didn't understand all of it. But one name kept popping up: Celia James. Ruby knew that name. She was the woman with sharp eyes and expensive shoes. The one who stood near the piano the night of the gala, barely blinking when Maxwell mocked her dad. The one who'd left before dessert, looking like she'd seen a ghost. The next morning, Ruby walked to the administration wing before school and waited near the parking lot. At exactly 8:07, Celia stepped out of a sleek black car and adjusted the strap of her leather bag. Ruby stepped into her path. "Excuse me." Celia looked down, paused. "You're Mr. Reed's daughter, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am." There was a flicker recognition, maybe regret. "Did you know he was a teacher here?" Ruby asked. Celia's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. "I did," she said carefully. "Did you know why he left?" Celia's silence was answer enough. "My dad helped a student, and they punished him for it. That's what I think." Celia looked away. "You don't have to say anything." Ruby continued, voice steady. "But if you're going to pretend you don't remember, at least stop staring at him like you do." And just like that, she turned and walked away. That afternoon, Celia stood alone in her office, the skyline stretching behind her. She stared at a framed certificate on her shelf, the Lexington Legacy Award, with her name etched in gold. It felt heavier than it used to. She opened her bottom drawer and pulled out an old folder. Inside was a photo, a younger Thomas conducting a chamber group. She had taken it years ago, back when music was still about meaning, not metrics. Meanwhile, in the janitor's closet, Thomas sat on a folding chair with an old notebook in his hands. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside were pages of compositions, lesson plans, scribbled ideas, and on one worn-out page, Lullaby for R, unfinished. His fingers trembled as he traced the first bars. It had been written for Rachel, his wife, the one who used to tell him, "You don't play the notes, Thomas. You bleed through them." He hadn't touched that melody since her funeral. The next night, Ruby stayed late, while her dad worked an after-hours event. She sat in the balcony sketching quietly, when Maxwell's voice echoed through the hall once more. "Looks like your father's polishing again. Honestly, it's almost romantic the way he worships that instrument. Tell me, does he sing to it at night?" She stood before she even realized it. Walked down the aisle, straight to the edge of the stage. "Do you always make fun of people who are better than you?" she said. Maxwell blinked. Thomas, halfway through wiping the bench, turned sharply. "Ruby." But she wasn't finished. "You know what's funny? He used to teach here. He used to teach kids how to feel music. But now, people like you laugh because he cleans. You think that makes you better?" Maxwell's smugness faltered for the first time all evening. Celia had entered quietly from the side door. She stopped in her tracks, watching it unfold. Thomas stepped beside his daughter, voice low. "Enough, Ruby." "No," she said. "Not this time." She reached into her backpack, pulled out a folded sheet of music, the one she'd copied from his notebook. She handed it to him. "You don't have to explain. Just play." And in that pause, half breath, half silence, Thomas realized something terrifying. She believed he still could. Thomas stared down at the sheet of music in his hands. The pencil marks were smudged, incomplete. The tempo scribbled out and rewritten. The melody fractured in places like it had been started and stopped 100 times. He hadn't touched that piece in years, hadn't dared. But now Ruby, his daughter, the only person who still saw him as something more than a mop and a name tag, was asking him not with a demand, but with belief. And that kind of belief, it stripped away every excuse he had. Still, he didn't move. The silence pressed against him like a wall, one built from years of shame, of playing small to avoid being noticed, of surviving, not living. His fingers twitched at his side. Celia, still standing off to the side near the exit doors, hadn't spoken a word. Her eyes were fixed on the father and daughter at center stage, one afraid of being seen, the other daring him to be. Maxwell, of course, chuckled, the sound brittle. "What a moment," he said, voice dripping sarcasm. "Will he play? Won't he? Should we dim the lights and cue the sob story?" Thomas turned to leave. But then Ruby said something so quiet, so personal, he almost missed it. "You told me once that silence is full of the things we're too scared to say. Maybe tonight is when you say them, Dad." He closed his eyes. Just for a second. Then he turned, walked across the stage and sat down at the bench. Not like a performer, like a man coming home. He didn't even open the sheet Ruby had handed him. He didn't need to. He'd written the notes with his grief. The hall was mostly empty, save for a few lingering event staff, Celia, and a now suddenly silent Maxwell. Thomas let his hands hover over the keys. He didn't test a chord, didn't warm up, just let his fingers fall slowly onto the beginning of the lullaby, the one he had written for Rachel before life unraveled. The first note was shaky, not wrong, just human. It trembled with something raw and unsanitized. Then came the second, the third. A phrase started to form, slow and soft, like a bedtime story, whispered through tears. The room held its breath. Celia moved closer to the edge of the stage, one hand clutching the railing like she was trying to anchor herself to something. Maxwell's smirk had vanished. As the melody built, Thomas's body softened. His spine straightened, his shoulders lowered. The song wasn't just music. It was memory. It was everything he had buried under bleach and obligation. It rose measure by measure into something fragile, but unbreakable. Ruby sat cross-legged near the front row, hands in her lap, tears brimming. Not because it was sad, but because it was him, the real him. And then the melody paused. A break in the rhythm. The same place he'd always stopped before. He looked out at the empty rows, at Celia, at Ruby, and he kept going. The ending wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was honest. And when the last note faded into the rafters of Lexington Hall, it left behind something more powerful than applause. It left behind truth. Thomas stood slowly. The silence lingered, not awkward, but sacred. He nodded once to Ruby, then turned, picked up his rag from the floor, and walked off stage. Celia stayed behind. Her heels echoed softly as she walked toward the piano. She didn't sit, just ran her fingers along the keys he'd touched moments ago. A single F-sharp sang out clear and trembling. She closed her eyes. Backstage, Ruby caught up to her father. "You did it," she whispered. Thomas didn't smile. Not yet. He just said, "I think I remember how it feels now." That night, Ruby uploaded a grainy recording from her phone to a private YouTube link. She didn't share it publicly. Not yet. But she sent it to one person, Celia James. No caption, no subject line, just a message that read, "You were there. So now you know." The next morning, Celia watched the video twice. The first time she watched Thomas. The second she watched Ruby. How still she sat. How much hope lived in her expression. That afternoon, she called an emergency meeting with the board. When Maxwell arrived late, and smelling faintly of whiskey, he rolled his eyes. "Please tell me this isn't about last night's soap opera." Celia didn't respond immediately. She slid a printed screenshot of Ruby's video across the table. The opening frame showed Thomas's hands just before they began to move. "We're reinstating Thomas Reed." Maxwell's brow lifted. "You're joking." "No," Celia said, tone razor sharp. "I'm correcting a mistake. One I was part of." The room fell still. "You think just because the janitor cried over some piano keys that suddenly he didn't cry?" Celia snapped. "He remembered who he was. And so did I." One board member leaned forward. "We'd need a cause. A justification." "You want a justification," Celia replied. "We fired the only teacher in this building who ever risked his job to protect a student from a man we still let sit on our donor board." Maxwell's face drained of color. "You can't prove I can," she said, holding up a flash drive. "And so can Ruby Reed." It was quiet then. The kind of quiet that comes when foundations begin to crack. Maxwell stood. "This'll cost you." "No," Celia said. "It's already cost too much." As he stormed out, Celia leaned back in her chair, exhaled deeply, and finally allowed herself a moment of stillness. And somewhere down the hall, Ruby stood outside the office, pressing her sketchbook to her chest. She hadn't planned to eavesdrop, but she heard enough. And when she looked down at the drawing she'd just finished her dad on the piano bench, Celia standing beside him, she wrote 2 words in bold at the bottom of the page, "Coming back." The words "coming back" were still fresh on the paper when Ruby tucked the sketch into her backpack. She didn't tell her dad what she'd overheard, not yet. Not until it was real. Not until the system that had erased him finally said out loud that it had been wrong. For now, it was hers to carry a small, quiet secret that something was finally shifting. Thomas noticed it, though. That night, while they were washing dishes, he glanced at Ruby and caught something in her eyes. A calmness. A knowing. Like she had seen a storm coming and already found the umbrella. He didn't ask. He'd learned that with Ruby, when it mattered, she'd find her moment. The call came the next afternoon. Celia's voice on the other end of the line wasn't formal or clipped like usual. It was hesitant. Real. "I'd like to meet," she said. "Not as an administrator, not as anything official. Just someone who used to listen better than she spoke. They met in the empty auditorium after hours. The seats were dark. Only the stage lights buzzed faintly above. Celia stood near the edge, arms folded, not defensive, just holding herself together. "I watched the video," she said, nodding toward the piano. "Twice." Thomas didn't speak. She looked at him. "I was in that room the day they asked you to resign." I didn't say a word. I told myself I had to protect the school, the donors, the name. But really, I was protecting myself. Still, he said nothing. "I was a student here when you taught," she added. "You probably don't remember. I was quiet, precise, terrified of playing wrong." Thomas nodded. "Celia James, you used to rush the first 8 bars of every slow piece." She blinked, stunned, then laughed softly, brokenly. "You remember." "I remember students who listened," he said, "even when they played scared." They stood in that warm silence for a moment. No agenda, no titles, just 2 people holding truths. Then Celia said, "We want you back, as a guest lecturer, for now. We'll make it official once the board finishes the vote." But the groundwork's laid. Thomas looked at the stage. "I don't need my old title back. I know," she said. "But we need what you bring. The kind of music that doesn't come from curriculum." A few nights later, the Lexington Conservatory hosted its monthly community gala. Celia extended an open invitation to Thomas. He said no at first, said he'd rather keep the mop than grab a mic. But Ruby was already stitching a little pocket into her coat, just big enough for the folded lullaby sheet. "You're not going to play it for them," she said, as he raised an eyebrow. "You're going to finish it for Mom. You said you never played it all the way through." Thomas stood in the kitchen, holding that paper in his hands like it might dissolve. "She never got to hear it," he whispered. "Then, let's make sure someone does." That night, Ruby wore her best sneakers, the ones with paint smudges she refused to wash off because they've got soul. Thomas wore his old concert jacket pulled from a box he hadn't opened in 4 years. It still smelled like cedar and regret. The gala was as glittery as ever. But something was different. The lights weren't as blinding. The music wasn't just polished. It had weight, meaning. Midway through the evening, after the violin solo and before dessert, the MC took the stage with a smile that knew more than it said. "We have an unexpected guest tonight," he began. "Some of you know his story. Some of you only think you do. But tonight, he's not here as a janitor, or even as a teacher. He's here as someone who's lived every note he's about to play." The lights dimmed. Thomas walked out slowly, not with flair, with gravity. He sat at the bench, nodded once toward the crowd, and placed the lullaby on the stand. It wasn't perfect. A few measures still wobbled. His hands trembled once near the bridge. But by the time he reached the coda, the place where he used to stop, he kept going. And the ending wasn't just music. It was memory. Rachel's name didn't need to be spoken. She was in every note. In the soft arpeggios, in the final unresolved chord that lingered like breath. As the sound faded, no one moved. It wasn't time for clapping. It was time for remembering. Ruby stood first, quiet, steady. Then Celia. Then the hall. Thomas didn't bow. He simply looked out over the crowd and nodded once. Later that night, as he stood backstage folding the sheet back into Ruby's coat pocket, she looked up at him and asked, "So now what?" He exhaled. "I think now. I stopped running from who I used to be." But before he could say more, Celia appeared with someone else beside her. A young girl, no more than 15, eyes wide, violin case in hand. "She asked to meet you," Celia said. "She said your lullaby made her feel something for the first time in a year." Thomas knelt down, extended a hand and smiled. Then, "Maybe it's time you learn how to make others feel the same." And as they stood there, 3 generations of stories strung together by music, Thomas realized playing again wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of something louder, something honest. And Ruby. She was already sketching the next chapter. The drawing Ruby finished that night showed her dad kneeling beside the young violinist, their hands almost touching the space between them, filled with faint, rising music notes. At the top, in her usual uneven handwriting, she'd written, "He doesn't just fix broken pianos. He reminds people they still have a song." She slipped it into her backpack before sunrise, just as Thomas brewed coffee in the kitchen. He stood silently by the stove, lost in thought, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug. The gala had passed, the applause faded, but something deeper lingered, something quieter than praise. That feeling of being seen again, not for his mistakes, not even for his talent, but for what he carried through all of it. By mid-morning, he was standing in the music department's practice wing, staring at a door he hadn't touched in 4 years. A placard read, "Room 213, Theory and Composition Lab." His name wasn't on it anymore, but the memory was. Celia met him there with a clipboard and an apologetic smile. "The official title is guest educator," she said, handing him a badge. "But let's be honest. They're not here for the title. They're here for the sound." Inside, half a dozen students sat with instruments on their laps and quiet curiosity in their eyes. Some recognized him from the video Ruby had discreetly uploaded last week, now making its quiet rounds in the artistic corners of the internet. Others only knew the rumors, the janitor who used to teach the man who played grief like a hymn. Thomas didn't give them a lecture. He simply sat at the old upright piano in the corner and said, "Play it like it matters. That's all I'll ever ask of you." It became the phrase he ended every class with. And students stayed after, not for extra credit, but for the quiet wisdom that hung in the air when he spoke of how silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything you're not ready to say. Meanwhile, Ruby walked the halls like she owned them, not out of arrogance, but out of knowing she had helped rebuild something. Her dad's story was no longer a secret, but a reminder. It didn't take long for the invitations to start arriving. Local veteran centers, a public school in Queens, a shelter downtown that ran weekly art therapy nights. They wanted him not for polished performances, but for something messier, truer. One Thursday evening, Thomas performed at a rehab clinic where a boy, barely old enough to shave, burst into tears halfway through a Debussy prelude. Afterward, he approached Thomas and said, "I used to play. Before everything fell apart. I didn't think I deserved to anymore." Thomas looked him in the eye and said, "We don't play music because we've earned it. We play because it remembers us when we forget who we are." The boy nodded, and for the first time in months, asked to sit at the piano. That same week, Celia arranged something unexpected. She called Thomas out of class early and met him outside the school, iced coffee and hand sunglasses tucked into the collar of her blouse. "You trust me, right?" He eyed the coffee. "I'm suspicious of bribes." She smiled. "It's cinnamon oat milk. I do my homework." They drove in comfortable silence through Brooklyn until she pulled up in front of a faded brick building tucked between two brownstones. A rusted plaque read, "St. Alora's Community Chapel." Inside, dust floated in golden shafts of light. Stained glass caught the afternoon sun like fractured stories. But what drew Thomas's eye was the baby grand piano near the altar, its lid closed, worn edges soft with time. "This is where I played my first solo recital," Celia said quietly. "I was 10. I remember the air buzzing in my chest before the first note. My mom wore red. She didn't look up once." Thomas approached the piano, running his fingers over the closed lid. "You haven't been back here?" She shook her head. "Not since the funding dried up. The music program dissolved. The space was offered to a real estate firm last year, but I asked the foundation board to hold off." He looked up. "Why?" "Because I knew if you ever said yes to teaching again, you'd need a home. Not just a classroom. A room that remembers things." Thomas swallowed hard. "I can't repay you for this." "You're not supposed to," she said. "This isn't charity. It's restoration." They stood in the stillness, the kind of silence earned by people who know how to carry things without dropping them. Then Celia said softly, "I want this to be for Ruby too, for other kids like her. A place where second chances aren't whispered, they're celebrated." He didn't answer right away, just walked to the bench, lifted the lid, and played a single chord. The room responded not with echo, but with memory. Later that night, as he sat on the chapel steps, Celia beside him, and Ruby tracing chalk sketches on the sidewalk, Thomas said, "I used to think the worst thing that happened to me was losing music. Now, I think it was believing I had to lose it alone." Celia looked out at the sky. "You didn't lose it. You just set it down for a while." And just as she said that, Ruby called from the far end of the courtyard. "Dad, they want your picture by the piano with me. They said they finally see you." He stood slowly, brushing chalk dust from his hands. Took them long enough. But in his voice, there was no bitterness. Only the quiet joy of a man being stitched back into his own story. The photo they took that day, Ruby perched on the edge of the baby grand, her sketchbook in one hand, Thomas standing beside her, with his hand resting lightly on the lid, ended up pinned to the chapel wall. No gold frame, no spotlight, just thumbtacks and truth. Beneath it, in Ruby's handwriting, "We don't play for applause. We play to remember who we are." Thomas didn't ask to have it hung. He didn't need to. The chapel had slowly become more than a room with stained glass and soft acoustics. It became a place where forgotten things were allowed to breathe again. And over the next few weeks, he returned every day, sometimes to practice, sometimes to teach, sometimes just to sit on the bench and let the weight of the world settle somewhere other than his shoulders. Word began to spread. Not viral, not loud, but honest. A young teacher from Harlem brought his choir students for a Saturday session. A combat vet with shaky hands asked to listen from the back pew. A woman who hadn't touched a cello since her brother's funeral walked up and simply said, "Do you remember how to tune one?" And every time Thomas would nod, not because he had all the answers, but because people who know grief can sense it in others. The chapel wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a place where silence finally felt safe. Celia made herself present, but not intrusive. She handled the logistics, the permits, the programming, the funding, but let Thomas lead the rhythm. She'd watch from the side barefoot most days, her heels abandoned in the back office, like symbols of a life she no longer needed to perform. One rainy Tuesday, she arrived holding 2 coffees and a crumpled flyer. "You've been requested," she said. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "It's from Easton Public. Their music program got cut 2 years ago. The new principal wants to launch a pilot called Listening Rooms. Quiet performances in noisy places. They want you to start it." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of music, Ruby's drawing on one side, the lullaby notes on the other. "I don't think I ever wanted to be seen this much," he said. Celia smiled. "I don't think you wanted to be invisible either." That Friday, Ruby joined him at the school gym, transformed with folding chairs and Christmas lights strung across basketball hoops. No spotlight, no polished acoustics. Just a keyboard with a sticky F-sharp and a mic duct taped to a broomstick. Thomas opened with Debussy, then paused. "Music," he told the kids seated cross-legged on the floor, "isn't here to impress you. It's here to remind you what it feels like to feel." In the second row, a girl wearing headphones around her neck wiped her eyes and didn't bother hiding it. In the back, a boy whose hoodie covered most of his face leaned forward as if listening made him taller. Afterward, Celia stood near the door, watching parents, teachers, and students linger. She didn't speak, just sipped her coffee and let it soak in. Thomas approached, brushing the sweat from his brow. "That was," he began. "Necessary," she said. "That was necessary." Then she handed him an envelope. "What's this A proposal?" she said. "We turn the listening room into a foundation. Lessons, workshops, recitals. Funded, scaled, led by you." He blinked. "Celia." "You don't have to say yes," she interrupted. "Just Don't say no because you're scared it might matter. He held the envelope for a long moment, then nodded. I'll think about it. But even as he said it, he already knew the answer. That night, after Ruby had gone to bed, Thomas sat at his small kitchen table, the foundation documents open in front of him. His old music journal lay beside them, the final page still blank. He stared at it for a while before finally picking up a pen and writing at the top, third movement. The next morning, Ruby found him tuning the upright in the chapel. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're humming again," she said. "I am. Yeah." And not the sad kind. He chuckled, then looked up. "You think it's time for a recital here? Invite the people we've helped." "I think," Ruby said, "it's time we stop calling it a comeback. It's just life now." 2 weeks later, the chapel was alive. The ivy was trimmed, the old wooden chairs polished. A local florist donated white lilies for the altar. They called it the Listening Room First Gathering. There was no set list, no formal dress code, just people, veterans, students, former skeptics, widows with grief folded into their sleeves. Thomas walked onto the stage in his signature vest and tie. No tuxedo, no pretense. "I've been called a teacher," he began, "a janitor, a man who forgot how to play. But today, I just want to be a song." He played the piece he'd written the week before, a quiet, steady theme. No crescendos, just honest, grounded notes that sounded like someone finding peace without needing permission. Celia sat in the front row, hands clasped. Ruby sat cross-legged near the piano, her sketchbook in her lap. And as the final chord faded into the chapel beams, no one clapped right away. Because sometimes the greatest applause is silence filled with everything words can't hold. Outside, the evening light scattered across the stained glass like confetti. Inside, something sacred had just begun. The light that filtered through the stained glass that evening stayed with them long after the chairs were folded, the piano cover drawn, and the lilies began to wilt. It wasn't the kind of light you captured in photos. It was the kind that settled in the chest, that made people walk slower on their way out, that left them whispering instead of speaking. Thomas remained seated at the piano bench long after the last guest had left. His hands rested gently in his lap, as if even the air didn't dare break the spell. Ruby curled up on the floor beside him, her head resting against the side of the instrument sketchbook, still open on a half-finished drawing of the night. Celia sat nearby barefoot again, sipping tea from a chipped mug. None of them needed to speak. The music had done enough. Eventually, Ruby stirred. "Dad," she said softly, "that new piece you played." It sounded like something letting go. Thomas exhaled. "It was," he said. "It was the part of me that thought I'd missed my moment." She looked up at him. "And now," he smiled faintly, "now I think maybe the moment was just waiting for me to show up." The next day, the photo from the recital, the one Celia's assistant snapped, right as the final chord echoed, circulated quietly through the foundation's mailing list. No fanfare, no press, just a subject line. Sometimes the most important music is the kind you almost didn't play. But people noticed. Within days, they were flooded with messages. Not from donors or critics, but from people. A woman in Ohio who'd put away her violin after her husband died. A teenager in Texas who hadn't spoken in therapy for months, but cried through Thomas's live stream. A principal from a school in Philadelphia asking if the listening room could come, help us remember we still matter. Celia printed every message and posted them on a corkboard in the chapel hallway. She didn't tell Thomas. She wanted him to see for himself. And he did the next Thursday when he arrived early for lessons. He stood in front of the board for several long minutes, not saying a word. Then, he reached into his back pocket, took out a small thumbtack, and pinned up a napkin Ruby had doodled on. 3 stick figures labeled Dad, me, and the piano. Underneath it, she had written, "This is what remembering looks like." Later that afternoon, while Thomas led a group of local middle schoolers in a workshop about musical storytelling, Ruby sat in the back row watching. She noticed the way he leaned in, when kids spoke the way he nodded, Instead of corrected the way he treated their small, uncertain melodies, like they were symphonies in the making. When they left the chapel that evening, the sky was turning peach over the rooftops. Ruby tugged his sleeve. "Can I play something next time?" He paused, surprised. "You want to?" She nodded. "I've been writing something, just lines, ideas." He smiled. "Then next time, you'll open the recital." The following Saturday, the listening room hosted its second gathering, this time outdoors. Lanterns strung through the courtyard, folding chairs under maple trees, a borrowed speaker system that crackled more often than not. But no one minded. Celia opened the event with a simple welcome, then handed the mic to Ruby. She stepped onto the makeshift stage, clutching her sketchbook, not with nerves, but with quiet confidence. "I don't have a piano piece," she began. "Not yet. But I do have this." She opened the book and held it up, a full-page drawing of the chapel, filled with light music notes drifting through stained glass. People sitting close with eyes closed, not asleep, but remembering. She looked down. "This place used to be quiet," she said. "But not the good kind. The kind that forgets. The kind that makes you feel like you don't belong. But now it's loud in the best way. Loud with music, with second chances, with people learning they're allowed to try again." She turned to her dad. "And I want to thank my father, not for being perfect, but for being honest, for showing me that even when life breaks something in you, you can still create." The crowd was silent. Then came a standing ovation, not roaring, not chaotic, just full of warmth. Thomas blinked hard. He hadn't cried in years. Not really. But this cracked something open in him that no melody ever had. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline and the guests slowly departed, Thomas found Celia sitting on the chapel steps, her shoes off again, the last sips of cider in hand. He sat beside her. "You remember when you told me you used to play?" She nodded. "Why did you stop?" She didn't answer immediately. Then finally, "Because I thought I'd only be loved if I was flawless." "And now," he asked. She met his eyes. "Now I think maybe love lives in the flaws." They sat in silence for a while. Then Celia reached into her coat and handed him a small box. He opened it. Inside, a vintage metronome, polished wood, the inscription carved gently on the side, "To the man who made time meaningful again." Thomas swallowed. "You keep doing that," he murmured. "Doing what?" "Reminding me that it's okay to matter again." She didn't speak, just reached for his hand. And in that moment, under paper lanterns and early stars, there were no more lessons to learn, no more stages to reclaim. Only two people who had learned how to stop hiding. And one young girl, watching from the garden, drawing the next page.